The last chapter closed with a promise. Governing by assurance builds internal rigor first, and that internal rigor is ultimately what any external party is asked to trust. That promise has been sitting there since Part 3 ended, waiting for the conversation to actually turn outward. This chapter turns it outward. It moves from the enterprise itself to the regulator sitting across the table from it, and asks what governing by assurance actually requires of that relationship once both sides are willing to look at it honestly. Picture the familiar collection of static compliance work behind every regulatory relationship: policies, manual reporting silos, fixed audit cycles, historical data ledgers, rigid checkbox governance. None of it is wasted effort, and none of it will disappear. What has to change is what sits behind it: a shift from documents that describe intentions to telemetry that shows behavior, from a ledger that records what was done to a system that reveals what is actually happening right now. Picture the familiar collection of static compliance work behind every regulatory relationship: policies, manual reporting silos, fixed audit cycles, historical data ledgers, rigid checkbox governance. None of it is wasted effort, and none of it will disappear. What has to change is what sits behind it: a shift from documents that describe intentions to telemetry that shows behavior, from a ledger that records what was done to a system that reveals what is actually happening right now. Now name the problem that the collection has been quietly hiding. A regulator is expected to safeguard critical infrastructure, protect the public, and promote stable markets. Meeting that mandate has come to mean translating statutory intent into requirements, examining organizations against those requirements, and holding them accountable for meeting them. And yet the same regulators watch organizations with perfect on-paper controls stumble in practice again and again. Major incidents breach layers of documented protection. Investigations turn up risks that were flagged internally but never linked to any real change. On the other side of the table, operating teams invest heavily in compliance dashboards, only to watch a catastrophic failure bypass the entire apparatus that those dashboards were built to represent. Both sides are trying to do the right thing, and both are trapped in the same structure. The primary proof of safety has become the completion of the prescribed activity, not demonstrated performance under stress. That single sentence is the core conflict this chapter works to resolve. Activity-based compliance did not appear by accident, and the logic behind it is not wrong on its face. A regulator cannot monitor every system or attend every incident review directly. It needs scalable proxies for organizational health, and an organization that implements required controls, trains its staff, and documents its procedures is more likely to be operating responsibly than one that does none of those things. The trouble is that these activities tend to become the goal rather than the means. 3 patterns show where that shift causes real damage. Activity-based compliance is lagging by design because rules respond to failures that have already happened, and compliance stops watching for what comes next. It is structurally fragmented because different regulators and frameworks each demand their own parallel evidence stream, and none of those streams reflects the integrated reality of the living system underneath them. And it becomes highly performative because artifacts become the goal in themselves, allowing a well-staffed compliance function to coexist indefinitely with a highly fragile operational system. The gap this produces is not abstract. A single proficiency error during a power transfer once cascaded into equipment damage, and what mattered most in the aftermath was not that a control had failed to fire. It was that the ability to verify positional integrity had been lost entirely. The evidence on hand described the activity. The failure had happened at the level of outcome. That gap between what gets documented and what actually holds under stress is where the most serious failures live, and no one builds it on purpose. It simply fills the space left behind whenever the relationship between rules, evidence, and outcomes goes unstated. For contrast, define the shift this chapter argues for. While the activity-based model treats the primary goal as completing and documenting specified controls, the outcome-based reality treats the goal as ensuring the system detects, contains, and learns from real-world failures. Where the activity-based model treats proof of safety as a comprehensive evidence packet and an artifact library, Outcome-based reality treats proof of safety as demonstrated performance at the boundaries where failure actually concentrates. Where the activity-based model asks a supervisor to focus on what the organization has, its policies, tools, and frameworks, outcome-based reality asks the supervisor to focus on how the system behaves, specifically its responses under stress. And where the activity-based model treats frameworks as the ultimate checklist to satisfy, outcome-based reality treats those same frameworks as a shared vocabulary for naming the risks worth managing in the first place. Nothing in that last contrast throws frameworks away. It simply changes the job they are asked to do. Outcome-based regulation is a term that gets used loosely enough to sound like less oversight rather than more precise oversight. Inside this framework, it rests on three concrete pillars. The first pillar is outcomes that matter, what this book has called the boundary promise. Instead of discussing control effectiveness in the abstract, the conversation names a specific boundary and a specific promise attached to it, such as customer payment flows remaining available within defined tolerances. A promise that can actually be tested. The second pillar is measures that have meaning, built through QOQM trees. Rather than counting activities, the tree connects what the organization is protecting to the exact metrics that reveal whether it is succeeding. At Meridian Settlement Boundary, the relevant question is not whether a control exists. It is how quickly the organization detects a counterparty system degrading during peak processing, and what changes as a direct result of that detection. The third pillar is visible feedback loops, described here as living evidence. It is not enough to know what an organization cares about and how it measures progress. Supervision needs routines that demonstrate how an incident actually produced a change in pattern or runbook, evidence pulled from the operating system itself, rather than from a documentation library assembled afterward. This three-pillar structure becomes concrete through a three-step mechanism. Step 1 is system drift, the sensor stage, where a measurement spikes beyond a defined tolerance, such as degraded processing detected at a settlement boundary. Step 2 is a human decision, the intervention stage, where an operations team detects the anomaly and a specific decision gets recorded rather than lost in the noise of the moment. Step 3 is the runbook update, the adaptation stage, where the pattern itself changes and policy catches up to operational reality. This is the whole of what outcome-based oversight actually demands. A specific incident, a specific decision, a specific pattern update, and a confirmed improvement that can be checked rather than merely claimed. Shifting the inspection focus this way means a supervisor stops evaluating organizational resilience in general terms and anchors instead at specific boundaries where failure would most directly cause harm. For questions structure that anchor point, and they are meant to be asked in this order because each one depends on an honest answer to the one before it. Protection asks what the organization is protecting at this boundary, and why it matters beyond the organizational own walls. Structure asks how that protection has been expressed as a testable QOQM structure, so the outcome and the way it is observed are both clear rather than left as an aspiration. Drift action asks who decides when the outcome drifts, what actions follow, and what gets learned in the process. Adaptation asks how that learning changes patterns, runbooks, and policies going forward, closing the loop rather than filing it away. These four questions feel uncomfortable to an organization whose system is primarily built to produce artifacts, because there is no artifact that can stand in for an honest answer to any of them. The same four questions feel energizing to an organization that has genuinely connected governance to operational intent, because the answers are already sitting there, waiting to be described rather than manufactured. A supervisor who asks them consistently will quickly tell the two apart. An organization that cannot demonstrate feedback loop closure at its most critical boundaries is carrying unmanaged risk, regardless of how complete its artifact library appears from the outside. That single sentence is the practical payoff of the entire boundary lens. None of this requires throwing away NIST CSF, ISO 27001, or any other established framework, and nothing in this chapter argues that it should. What changes is the role those frameworks play in the conversation between regulator and operator, which is a smaller change to describe than it is to actually carry out. A framework was never meant to be the primary evidence of safety, even though years of activity-based practice have often treated it that way. A gavel resting on a locked, sealed framework document captures the habit precisely. The framework becomes the verdict itself rather than a tool for reaching one. Its real value sits elsewhere as a shared vocabulary, a common language a regulator and an operator can both use to name the same risk the same way, so that a control mapped on one side of the table means the same thing on the other side. Outcome-based regulation does not eliminate statutory requirements or sector-specific standards, and no organization should expect it to. What changes is simple to state and consequential to apply. Those requirements serve the specific outcome at the specific boundary, or they do not. A framework clause that cannot be traced to a boundary promise and a QOQM measure is not doing protective work, no matter how completely it has been documented. Underneath all of this sits a genuine tension that regulators cannot simply reason their way past, because regulation by its nature constrains behavior in order to prevent harm and uphold basic standards of fairness. Meeting that goal requires a real measure of predictability. When a regulator specifies a control, the expectation is that organizations implement it, not that each one privately decides for itself whether the control is worth the effort. Uniform controls applied to every organization in the same way carry real appeal against that backdrop. They are easily quantifiable, they fit cleanly into a spreadsheet, and they give a regulator a defensible basis for enforcement when something goes wrong. The illusion of control this produces is comfortable precisely because it is so measurable. Operational adaptability asks something harder of the regulator sitting on the other side of that comfort. It asks the regulator to accept that different organizations can demonstrate equivalent outcomes through entirely different means, and that the evidence for this is messier and more contextual than a uniform checklist ever was. The insight underneath the dilemma is simple to state and easy to underestimate. Uniform controls applied to non-uniform systems produce non-uniform outcomes. A large institution with sophisticated engineering and a small institution with a single IT generalist can implement the identical control and still produce entirely different levels of actual protection. Outcome evidence is what reveals that difference. Activity evidence hides it because it was never designed to detect it in the first place. Moving from principle to practice changes specific behaviors on both sides of the table, and neither side is asked to change alone. For the regulator, examination design shifts toward sampling feedback loops, rather than checking artifact ledgers, requesting QOQM structures and decision records at a small number of critical boundaries, rather than a comprehensive inventory of every control. Communication shifts toward supervisory letters that reference learning failures and outcome gaps, rather than missing policy documents. Evaluation shifts toward crediting genuine feedback loop closure, and toward crediting honesty about which boundaries still carry unresolved risk. For the regulated organization, the operating model shifts away from one-off evidence packages assembled for each audience, toward honest evidence generated as a natural byproduct of running the system well. The defense strategy changes because procedural compliance without operational resilience is no longer a tenable position to defend. And internal governance shifts toward managing the enterprise as though a technically skilled supervisor could walk in at any moment and ask, plainly, for the story behind a boundary. This shift is both liberating and demanding, and it is worth naming both halves plainly rather than only the comfortable one. It is liberating because it replaces fragmented, audience-specific reporting with a single coherent operating model, one where the evidence a regulator needs is the same evidence an operator already needs to run the system responsibly. A shattered shield stands in for the old protection. Once the organization stops treating every regulator's questionnaire as a separate production, the fragments fall away on their own, because there was never a real system underneath most of them, only the appearance of one. It is demanding because it removes the protection that activity-based compliance once provided. Under the old model, an organization could point to a completed checklist and call the conversation finished. Under this model, an organization can no longer claim compliance if the system it was protecting still failed at its outcome, because the checklist was always meant to serve the outcome rather than replace it. The defense of procedural compliance without operational resilience simply becomes untenable, In the same way that an engine cannot be certified sound by inspecting its paperwork while it stalls on the test bench. That is what governing by assurance asks of an organization at the regulatory boundary: comfort demonstrating internal governance at any time, not because a surprise inspection is expected, but because that level of clarity is what managing a critical system actually requires in the first place. An organization that has built this habit internally, the habit Chapter 15 described in detail, finds this demand far less unsettling than one that has spent years perfecting the appearance of readiness instead of the substance of it. Put every piece from this chapter into a single moving system, and the mechanism becomes clear. Systemic stress presses down on a boundary, the same kind of stress that a settlement boundary at meridian absorbs during a counterparty slowdown or a peak volume surge. A QOQM sensor positioned at that boundary detects the pressure and feeds it into a decision and learning loop, where the signal is processed rather than simply logged and forgotten. That loop produces two outputs: pattern changes that represent an adaptive risk response and runbook updates that represent an optimized procedure. Neither output is generated for a regulator's benefit in the moment it is created. Both exist because the operating team needed them to keep the boundary functioning under stress. Only after that does the third stage happen. Both outputs travel forward as living evidence, through a transmission that ultimately reaches the dashboards and reports a regulator actually reviews. Compliance, at the end of this loop, is no longer a separate parallel function competing for the same attention as operations. It becomes the transparent byproduct of operational excellence, generated because the system worked, not manufactured after the fact to prove that it did. The stakes behind this shift are not abstract, and they are not confined to any one industry. Market stability depends on it, because payment outages produce immediate public anger and financial cascading effects within hours. Human safety depends on it because health system failures cause direct physical harm to real people. National security depends on it because grid disruptions cripple the critical infrastructure an entire region relies on. The gap between what a compliance report shows and what a system can actually withstand is no longer a technical concern for specialists. It is a boardroom and legislative crisis in its own right because activity-based compliance consumes enormous examination capacity without producing resilience commensurate with that effort. This chapter closes on the mechanism that makes the entire argument actionable. When supervision primarily rewards activity, regulated entities respond exactly as any well-run organization would. They focus on maximizing activity. The incentive structure ends up producing precisely the behavior it was originally designed to prevent. The shift to outcome-based regulation does not require rewriting public law from scratch, nor does it ask any regulator to abandon their existing authority. It requires examining different evidence and treating different patterns as the primary basis for supervisory judgment. Change the signal, and the behavior on the other side of the table changes with it. That is the leverage point this entire chapter has been building toward, and it is the one the next chapter carries directly into the public sector.